Welcome to the FML podcast, the podcast on a mission to uncover actionable insights, explore the latest trends, and to catalyze your fintech's growth. Join Growth Gorilla's founder and managing director, Shamir Sajdev, and some of fintech's hardest-hitting marketers and leaders.
Welcome everyone to today's episode of the FML podcast. We're joined by Chantal Swainston, who's, you're a Fintech PR consultant, formerly Wise, and you're also the founder of The Herd. So you're a busy person.
Absolutely. I mean, why have one job when you can have a few?
Yeah, exactly. Why live a simple life? So as a bit of background to all the listeners, we met at an awards ceremony, I think, a few months ago, had some really good conversations, and I thought it would be great to get you onto the podcast because kind of looking at all the guests that we've had so far, we've actually never dug into PR. What I want to do is as a theme of today's episode, is just thinking about, what is the role of PR in marketing a fintech brand? And I think you're the perfect person for us to talk to about this. Let's tell everybody about your story so far. So how have you ended up where you are today? Tell us about yourself.
So I've been working in tech and fintech PR for almost a decade now, which has gone very, very quickly, and a lot has changed in that time. I originally started kind of straight out of uni with an English literature degree, which didn't set me up for a hugely direct career path, and kind of fell into PR as something that was interesting and creative and related to media, which I was also really interested in. I originally worked in quite a few agencies, specializing in lots of tech and fintech clients. So the likes of American Express, eBay, LinkedIn, but also the likes of kind of Klarna and Tink and open banking providers. And it was a real variation of different things, which I loved. And then was lucky enough to get a job with Wise, obviously a fintech brand that I was really passionate about and really loved, and was there for the last 4 years. Almost 4 years, looking after their UK PR. So it was a really amazing time to be with that business. So much has happened since they launched, but I was there from kind of pre-listing to post-listing to looking after their corporate kind of communications, as well as helping launch their first investment product, helping kind of manage some of their more difficult issues and crisis communications. So it was an amazing time, and I joined in lockdown as well, which was also a bit of an experience, getting a new job remotely. And then in the last 2 years, I also launched The Herd, which is the Women in Fintech Spokesperson Index. So that is a super simple concept. It is essentially a list of brilliant women that are working in fintech and financial services that want to do more public speaking and more public opportunities. You can kind of search through, we've got over 100 speakers now from all over the world. You can search by topic or location or job title and find people for your events or podcasts or whatever content it is that you're producing. So that's my better gender diversity in fintech media. So I guess that's the whistle stop tour.
I definitely want to talk more about what you're doing at The Herd, but also I want to jump in and start talking about sort of fintech PR. So let's start off with the fintech stuff, and we'll kind of end and talk a little bit more about, I suppose, the future of The Herd as well. That's super exciting. As I said, the theme of sort of today's episode is the role of PR in marketing a fintech brand. I always think, generally speaking, fintech and financial services marketing as a whole is very, very different from, marketing widgets or fashion or apparel or FMCG. From your perspective, what makes fintech PR so unique?
I think from the PR side, it's definitely an incredibly competitive space. I don't think you have to look very hard to see news constantly being pushed by a lot of the different fintech companies that exist. And it is quite a crowded market in all these different spaces, whether it's credit or payment or loans or B2B software or embedded finance. There's quite a lot of people offering relatively similar products. But then when I was thinking about that, I think also my experience in other industries proved that it's not too dissimilar, whether you're talking about, as long as you're in the tech space, there's always going to be a high level of competition. So in HR tech, retail tech, health tech as well, which is obviously seeing huge rise, that competition is incredibly fierce. So I'm aware that I've kind of answered the question and not answered the question there, but I think that level of competition basically isn't unique to fintech. But what I think is quite interesting about fintech and financial services is it's just incredibly highly regulated, and as it should be. but it does make it very difficult to create the personality or kind of maintain the brand whilst you're also trying to make sure that you're ticking all the boxes, not to get your wrist slapped by the FCA about how you're presenting a certain product. And I think getting that balance right is one of the many challenges. I think trying to maintain your brand personality whilst making sure that you're not saying something that you shouldn't and you're being clear, concise, and not misleading to customers is one of the challenges that I think a lot of people are facing.
I want to talk a little bit about creating that narrative and shaping that for a fintech brand. But as a sort of a quick question, which I'm sure the listeners have, is when should a brand, particularly a fintech brand, start thinking about PR and having something in place?
I completely relate to the fact that if you're a startup and you're thinking about budgets, PR is probably relatively low on the list of things that you are going to be shelling out for. But I think you should be thinking about PR as early as you possibly can, because ultimately your reputation is a long game and it is something that you develop over a number of years. There's a huge amount of benefits to making sure that you're doing these campaigns and announcing these products and making sure you're in front of the right journalists, but also it's developing those relationships with media, which now more than ever I think is really important given how crowded that market is and how many publications we're seeing kind of struggle. And I think also your reputation is a collection of the things that you do over a period of time. So you might put a story out in 5 years' time that benefits from 3 other campaigns that you did in the past that maybe didn't get amazing results, but now the journalist is looking back and saying, oh, actually, you've invested in transparency or you've invested in consumer finance education for this period of time, and actually that makes you much more credible. So I think I would encourage people to think of it as a long-term kind of commitment and to start thinking about it as early as possible, because ultimately people are forming opinions of you, whether you're feeding into them or not. So best to get in early, I think, is my recommendation.
And on that note of people forming opinions, I think that leads nicely into talking about that, creating a narrative. You know, what is the opinion that you want people to form about you, and how do you go about structuring that and creating that? And then I suppose, what does that ultimately then end up looking like in the press?
So I think the concept of kind of creating a good narrative is quite simple, I think, but just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy. So I think when it comes to kind of creating a compelling narrative or messaging, it's about being clear about what your product is, ultimately the benefit to your customer, whoever that is, and why your business is the best way to do it. And it sounds incredibly basic, but actually trying to condense that and make that super, super, super clear can be quite difficult. So I think it's just really important to be specific about each of those elements. And I think the other thing that sometimes fintech can be guilty of, and actually other tech as well, but just being really literal about what it is that you do and the problem that you solve. We see a lot of kind of messaging, especially in the tech space. It's kind of, if a journalist lands on your website, what do you say about yourself? And it'll be, pioneering problem solvers that transform your business through connections. And it's like, well, who are you and what do you do? Like, what is the product that you're selling? What is the problem that you're solving? Because that's not super clear. It can be difficult when you are also trying to stand out in the crowded market. But I think being clear and concise and having a really good idea of the problem that you are solving is the most important thing when you're creating a clear narrative.
Yeah, how does that ultimately then manifest in the sort of content that you're putting out there then? So obviously you create your narrative, you've made it clear, you made it concise. I think a lot of companies think sometimes they don't have enough to shout about. How do you kind of pull those things together and create stories to put out into the public?
It's kind of creating stories, but also finding ways where what you have to say and what you are working on is relevant to what's already in the media. So whether or not that is newsjacking something that's coming up. So some of the obvious ones that I know a lot of fintech companies are probably looking at is we've got the budget coming up on the 6th of March. Like, how can we comment on that? What regulation are we hoping to see? What kind of changes are we hoping to make? And I think what good companies will be doing will be kind of commenting and putting things out there in the press that are really closely aligned to their business, so that there's this consistent messaging where whenever we see X business, they're always talking about fairer finances for customers, better access to credit, something that it's being consistent over a period of time. And I think sometimes when you're in the business, you can get a bit like, oh, are we banging on the same drum over and over again because this is all we ever talk about? But actually, I think especially in the early stages, that's really important because people need to know what you stand for, and they might miss, 3 or 4 pieces of coverage where you've talked about that, but actually you need to be doing it consistently and constantly over a period of time to get known for it. So yeah, I think just being consistent and don't be afraid to keep saying the same thing.
I would say it's the same principles as I think any form of advertising. I remember when we were running campaigns and I was switching out to my early sort of days, and I was switching out the ads that we were doing. And I remember my agency at the time, who was like the former head of marketing at McCain, called me up and just went, "What are you doing? Leave it on there for a few weeks because no one's seen your ad." And I was like, you've been looking at it all day long. They haven't. And when we kind of slowed down a little bit in terms of sort of swapping out the message, we had a lot more cut through at that point. So yeah, 100% agree with you. One of the other sort of things I kind of want to I suppose, learn and understand is, I think in my view, social media has massively changed, and correct me if I'm wrong, the landscape of PR, right? Because you've now got Twitter, you've now got LinkedIn, but you've also got a whole host of podcasts. You've got independent publications, influencers, and we're not talking about TikTok influencers here, but sort of, business leaders here. What's the mix of running sort of PR activity for the brand and then PR or creating a spokesperson for the brand as well, and I suppose or developing a thought leader? What's what's your approach to that? What do you think the balance is, and how does a brand tackle that?
I guess there's a couple of things in there. I think you're absolutely right. I think the role of social media has changed the way that we look at sort of traditional PR significantly, because back when I first started out in my career, it was very much kind of, here's a list of, we wouldn't do it this way today, but here's a list of titles you're going to call and you're going to sell them this piece of research and hopefully they're going to cover it. And if you do, then job done. We've obviously come a long way since that. So the role of B2B influencers or LinkedIn influencers and the podcasts and the platforms that we've got today should definitely be baked into your PR strategy, almost as if they are publications, because at the end of the day, it's getting in front of your audience, and it depends where your audience is. Maybe your audience is reading FinExtra every morning. I know I am. Maybe your audience is listening to the 11SFS Fintech Insider podcast. Maybe they're reading, Simon Taylor's Brain Food. Wherever they are, that's where you should be, regardless of whether or not that's a traditional magazine or if it's a more digital platform. So I think we should be separating those things less and considering them all part of the PR narrative and making sure that they're kind of baked into any external communications, making sure that we're considering those platforms, those newsletters, those podcasts as part of our kind of pitching process. I guess in terms of the second point, was that about kind of, sorry, I'm kind of double checking the question, but was that about kind of creating?
Yeah, a very long-winded question that wasn't structured that well. I think that balance between having a spokesperson for the brand and then helping them establish themselves, becoming a thought leader, and what's that balance?
It's definitely an interesting one. And I think there's also the consideration that when you have a brand spokesperson, they've also got a day job, but 9 times out of 10. So they can't just be available to do marketing and PR all the time. So I think it's kind of making sure that they are happy and committed and willing to be the face of the business. The other thing that I think is really interesting, especially in tech PR, is this real kind of like celebritization of founders and the way that we kind of position people that work in businesses. It's become a lot more personal over the years. Back in the day, it was enough to just be able to talk about your career and how you'd got to where you'd got to and the success of the business. And now a lot of these business profiles are asking kind of like how you balance your work life and having kids and what do you eat for breakfast in the morning. And they're a lot more personal. And I think there's also an element of making sure that we're prepping our spokespeople for that ever so slight sometimes it's slight and sometimes, depending on your spokesperson, it can feel a little bit invasive, making sure that people are prepared and happy and comfortable talking about themselves in that way, because increasingly I think that's what media are looking for. It's kind of a personal story. So I think it's really important to make sure that we're prepping spokespeople for those questions and that kind of line of interview, as well as the normal business communication side of things.
We've kind of talked about sort of PR in the sense of driving brand awareness fundamentally. But I suppose the other side of it is, and again, I think fintechs and financial services are very prone to this, which is, I suppose, that crisis management piece. Obviously, not always by their own fault, but sometimes there's a compliance issue or a systems breakdown or something happens, and that needs to be managed. How do you approach that? How do you approach crisis management? It'll be great to kind of understand the impact of and the role of PR in crisis management. And yeah, if you talk us through any sort of previous experience, that'd be fantastic.
I think the way that fintechs get covered has also changed a lot over the years. When everything was first launching after 2008, the press could not be more complimentary about the fact that there was this huge disruptive effect happening within financial services. And everything that was popping up was great because it was an antidote to the banks who had got everything wrong. And then I think 6 or 7 years after that, the criticism started to sort of gently roll in. And for a lot of businesses, it was a bit of a shock because they'd only really had good press. And I think one of the things that's important, and a lot more businesses are seeing it now, it's not as unusual, but you have to kind of get comfortable with the fact that you're not going to be loved every single day. If you're building a business, like things are going to go wrong, unfortunately. People are possibly going to go to the press to make complaints, and these things happen, and you need to be prepared to manage them. You can't have your head in the sand and hope that it will never happen. And that said, I think there's also a lot of different types of crisis. And I'm always really mindful of using the word crisis because I think it can be quite dramatic. It's like, is it a crisis or is it an issue? And I think a lot of probably what I've dealt with would be some crises, but closer to issues, I think. There's kind of two different trains of thought that you mentioned before, where you've got something that's maybe bubbling up in the business. Maybe there's been an issue with a regulator that's going to have to go public at some point. Maybe you've got a round of layoffs that are going to have to happen, and you know that internal memo, as they want to do, will probably end up in TechCrunch at some point. There's things that you can predict and prep for. And I think those are easier to manage naturally because you're not kind of caught off guard. The key is always making sure that you're really close to the people who have made those decisions, that it is crystal clear across the business why things have happened the way they have, and that you have prepared for pretty much every eventuality that comes up. So working in PR for a long time, you become a bit of a catastrophizer. You sit in front of a situation and go, what is the worst possible case that could come out of this, and how can we prep for almost all of it so that you're not panicking on the day when journalists are calling? And that's a preferred problem to have. And then you've got those ones that really blindside you, that kind of crop up out of nowhere, that are super unpredictable, that nobody in the business knew was going to happen. And as you say, that can be a lot of things. That can be external research into your business product. I don't know if you saw the news this morning, but there was, I think Santander had got caught out complaining to the Advertising Standards Association about Nationwide's adverts. And it's one of those where you can imagine that the people working in Santander's PR business probably didn't see that one coming, and now they're having to field a lot of calls and kind of process what's gone on there. So those are the ones that kind of catch you off guard. And I think the main advice, and I have to tell myself this every time I'm working on something like that, is always to not panic, to take your time, not get caught up in the journalists' deadlines, because you are infinitely better off saying the right thing late than saying the wrong thing on their deadline. You can't retract it. And also you shouldn't be saying anything to anyone until you fully understand what's gone in the business. So I think it's kind of taking a step back, getting everybody in a room together, working out what the next steps are, communicating it internally as well as externally, because I think also if you're in bigger businesses, people are going to have their own opinions and they don't realize that can be associated with their employer. So it takes a lot of internal and external comms to make sure that you handle those well. And I think you can always have a process in place, even if you can't predict what the issue is. And I would recommend that there is a process in place, no matter what stage of business you're in, to handle something like that.
I want to move away from the negative of crises. Like you said, we're talking about issues here, not crises. But I want to kind of go back to sort of talking about narratives. One of the things, fintech brands, especially the sort of more earlier stage, not necessarily seed stage, but earlier stage brands, kind of get into, or sometimes the mistake that they make is they spend a lot more time talking about perhaps some of the features of their products, and it's sometimes, well, does the audience really care about that feature? And I think fintech being on, thinking about the tech side of fintech, is how do you make something that is, perhaps a fantastic innovation, but the fundamentals of it are probably somewhat boring to the average person. How do you then get that into sort of mainstream media to, obviously then drive the awareness of the brand and make it somewhat interesting?
When you're in the thick of it and when you're working on these products, you do think that everything you're working on is great. There is a little bit of kind of getting so caught up and drinking the Kool-Aid. And I think that's what you need your PR people to kind of say, this is great for maybe a blog, but maybe it's not going to work for news. It's not going to It's not going to hold the front page of the Sunday Times. You do need a bit of a filter for that. But I think, that said, there is still a time and a place for product and innovation in the mainstream media. And I think one of the things that we're really mindful of with Wise, we obviously had really good relationships with a lot of our customers, really, really positive feedback from them. And it was much easier to position the product in a really positive way via customer stories and case studies than it was to just try and do that cold to journalists. And I think also you then get to wrap the benefits of your product into a real person's lifestyle. And it gives you the opportunity to show exactly the problem that you're solving without it becoming too salesy. Because I think that's another issue that we have sometimes with PR, especially, is that I think we all need to remind ourselves that it is not the journalist's job to write about your product, and it's not the journalist's job to do advertising for you. If anything, quite the opposite. I've had conversations with journalists where they're like, I just can't write that. It's too much of a puff piece. And it's not necessarily because it's a bad story. It's just too promotional. So I think it's, finding ways to tell the story that is maybe a little bit different, either whether that's through case studies. I do think research, it's just really difficult to pitch research these days. A lot of people are kind of pulling it together and firing it out. I've got my own blog and I get kind of research stories on fintech quite a lot, so I can see firsthand how competitive that is. But there are definitely ways to go about it. I think case studies is probably the best one if you're going for kind of that real national top tier media, because it just makes it a bit more human. So yeah.
I think something that we as an agency can relate to, particularly when it comes to, when we talk about influencers, say, for example, or influencer marketing, is what impact am I going to see on the bottom line? I know PR has always kind of had to deal with that as well. To that point, what are the KPIs that you're measuring to perhaps give directional results for a campaign? How are you, measuring success? What impact is PR having on the bottom line?
Absolutely fair. And I think in this day and age, we're all having to defend our value a little bit more to clients, which is absolutely fair. They need to know what they're getting for their money. That said, PR is famously difficult to measure, so it's always been a tricky balance. I think something that you probably will deal with as well is one of the main questions I always ask when I'm taking on a new brief or speaking to a new client is kind of what is the aim of that PR? Because increasingly doing some PR or doing some marketing for the sake of it, it's less and less valuable. And yes, there is brand building and that's important, but if that's what you're after, then that's what you need to say. Or are you looking to go and raise soon and you want to kind of get in front of a selection of investors? Or are you launching a new product and you want to have a load of conversations with consumer press beforehand so that you can kind of ship this out to them when it's ready to go? I think it's being really clear about what the business goal is for that PR, or what the ideal business goal would be for that PR. And then I think it's working backwards to kind of get them to that point. So would a piece in the Sunday Times business section be the best thing for you? Or is it an opinion piece in Sifted to get you in front of those VCs? Or is it actually just getting really far and wide coverage to help bump up your SEO or push down a story that you don't want to see on Google Analytics anymore? Like what specific is it that you're trying to do, and work backwards from there. And then I think it also comes down to having a really good relationship with whoever it is that you're working for, because those results aren't really measurable from an external perspective. It needs to be, I then went into a meeting and somebody said, oh, I'd seen that article, or I really loved your piece on this, or I got invited to talk to an event for free because of this news piece. So I appreciate those are kind of less tangible results, and that probably makes some people feel a bit uncomfortable, which I totally appreciate. But it's one of the things that PR can do really, really well, is those bigger reputation kind of vaping. And it's important to have a good relationship with your PR person so that you can feed that back. Because then if something has been successful, or if something has got you a new business lead, or then we know that we can do more of that and we'll deprioritize the other stuff. So I think looking at PR as supportive for business growth, and not just punting out a press release because you've got a new product every 3 to 6 months.
A couple of things come to my mind in terms of a few things that you had mentioned. We spoke about obviously the changing landscape, from what was traditional PR in the olden days, where you kind of went through journalists, to now obviously the impact of social media and I suppose individual influencers, and kind of like linking those sort of things together. How do you see influencers, within a space? or how do you see them playing a role in a company's PR strategy?
Increasingly so. I think depending on who you're working with, they add a huge amount of credibility. They have a very tailored, specific audience. They're becoming increasingly important in the way that we manage reputation. These are people that are, called up by CNBC to share their thoughts, and they are, brought into these bigger conversations, maybe with governments and things like that. So not all of the influencers are just for media. There's actually a huge amount of other reasons why we should be engaging with them as well. And I think the other thing as well is, as I kind of mentioned, the dwindling media landscape. Unfortunately, like we have seen so many layoffs in various different publications. Being so reliant on the existing platforms is not smart, to be honest. So there's other ways around that depending on your brand as well. I think you can also invest a lot in your own content, and I think that's something that we're seeing a lot of companies do a really good job of, is creating their own social media pages and platforms and blogs that are almost independently incredibly useful outside of whether or not you're using that product or not. So I think Yonder do a really good job of this, the credit card company. I'll be honest, I'm a
Yeah,
huge
yeah.
fan. But their kind of Instagram is incredibly
We,
lifestyle.
we we had Tom on the
Oh, there we
podcast
go.
actually.
Oh,
So
so yeah, they've invested a huge amount in kind of creating their own lifestyle brand so that they're not reliant on having to go to publications every time that they want to push an interesting story. They're building their own platform and engaged audience, and I think that's a really smart way of doing it. And I think that's something that fintech companies should be definitely considering moving forwards, because the reliance on those traditional publications should be, I'm not saying we should rely on them less, but I'm just saying we should have a broader reach. But also we should be supporting those publications. So buy a subscription and look after your local trade journalists.
Chantal, that's been fantastic. I don't want to end though without kind of talking about the herd, which obviously we discussed at the top of the episode. You kind of gave us a whistle stop tour. What would be great to understand is, I suppose, the idea behind it, what your aim is with the herd, and I suppose the future of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm super passionate about it, so always happy to talk about it. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, it is a really simple concept. If anybody wants to go and have a look at the website, it's just a list of speakers covering all of their key topics, availability, location. And it was essentially born out of a process of working in tech PR for a very long time and sourcing speakers for various different events, turning up to these different events and thinking, we could have done better, they could have done better, we could have been more gender diverse. And I think when I first launched The Herd, I was probably actually a bit naive to the challenge of getting good gender diversity in events. I was very much like, we've built this index, we've got this list, you can go and research, problem solved. And I think now that I've been kind of working with a few more events and producers, and also the brilliant women that we've got listed, I'm starting to see actually the complexities run a little bit deeper than that. And it can sometimes be difficult to get people available on short notice. And it's a really interesting process to also kind of learn about it properly myself, from having been on the outside to now kind of being on the inside. So one of the things I was keen was to try and help solve that problem as well. So we've recently launched a list of services. So that includes things like public speaking training. We can do media partnerships. We can work with events to help kind of pitch and secure speakers. We can prep them. So it's working to kind of really make that process a lot easier for everyone involved, essentially. And also to just keep building out the index as well, and keep increasing the people that we've got on there. So yeah, it's grown significantly since we launched, and we won an award last year, which is very exciting. So yeah, it's just taking it from strength to strength, hopefully.
Well, Chantal, it's been absolutely fantastic having you on. But before we go, I'd like to take you through the quick fire round. So hold on to your chair. Other than the FML podcast, what other podcasts are you listening to right now?
I'm going to go really non-corporate, but one of my favorite podcasts is No Such Thing as a Fish. So it is written up by the people that do the research for QI, and it's essentially a lot of facts and interesting things that happen in the world that probably a bit nerdy, that you can bring up at dinner parties and impress people with.
And then obviously your ex-Wise. So other than Wise, what is your favorite fintech brand?
I think if it wasn't Wise, I think it probably would be Yonder. I'm a huge fan. I use the credit card all the time. I love getting hefty discounts on nice dinners. It's perfect for me.
And then what books are you currently reading, or would you recommend to our audience?
I have just finished, so I'm in between books, but I've just finished Fuck Being Humble by Stephanie Sword Williams. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear, but I've done it now. But it's a it's a really great book on basically being a bit more shameless and self-promotional, which is obviously something that we're really keen on at The Herd, but has also been really good for me since going freelance to try and push myself out of my comfort zone. So I really recommend it.
And then my last yet favourite question is, what's one thing that I haven't asked that perhaps I should have?
I'd probably just plug The Herd again, honestly. If anybody is working on any kind of content at the moment and they are looking to improve their gender diversity, please do take a look at our website. Please do get in touch. We're more than happy to help. Something that I'm very passionate about. So
amazing. And what is the website? What's the URL?
it is the-herd.co.uk. Couldn't get The Herd. We've all been there.
Yeah, apparently like growthgorilla.com's $5,000. So I was like, no, they can keep it for the moment. We'll be .co.uk, whatever. We're proud of them, so it's fine. Good. Chantal, thank you very, very much for your time today. It's been absolutely fantastic speaking with you.
Thanks very much.
The FML podcast is brought to you by Growth Gorilla. To find out how our marketing growth experts can boost your fintech's growth, head to growthgorilla.co.uk. And make sure to search for the FML podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Don't forget to click follow to ensure you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Growth Gorilla, thanks for listening.